and thank you to Justice for All Canada for organizing this panel. I'm also grateful to have both very good friends, Alex Neve and Farid, to be also a part of sharing their views and opinion. As my two other colleagues, I am also talking to you here from Ottawa, the national capital, but also the unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, nation. It is very actually important. I'm glad that Justice for All Canada organized this event about foreign policy because, as both Farid and Alex mentioned previously, we didn't see, I wouldn't say at all, but very rare were the occasion where foreign policy was evoked by the leader of the major party here in Canada. And it is unfortunately that it gives the impression that the foreign policy is something far away, something that does not interest Canadian, which is of course not the case. And this election is also not an exception. Foreign policy remains one of the most forgotten topics among the ones that are crucial to understand and assess Canadian politics, and for voters to make an enlightened decision. But yet foreign policy receives very, very little attention and remains dismissed and frankly sometimes purposely ignored. I would give some reasons why it is that the case. I mean, those are my personal kind of humble sort of reflection about the situation. There are very few Canadian journalists who are knowledgeable about foreign questions, and the number of foreign correspondents has been cut throughout the years from the national broadcaster. That doesn't mean that there are not journalists invested into the matters, but there are less and less who are experts in those matters. So that makes the rest of the journalists a little bit insecure, and they don't want to ask questions about situation that they are not familiar with. When foreign questions are raised, they are most of the time related to the bilateral relations with principally the American neighbors, but emerging powers around the world, like in Asia, South America, Africa, those relationships remained ignored. And as both Farid and Alex mentioned, if they are tackled, they are going to be based mainly tackled from a trade perspective and not necessarily from any other sort of policy, and specifically any sort of human right or other sort of angles. Many Canadians also are made to believe by some politicians and journalists that what really matters in the elections are questions like jobs, healthcare, and more recently they are including environment. But these are indeed, I mean, yes, of course, these are indeed very important issues, but they cannot fully understood if we don't have a global perspective of the world. For example, to go back to the question of selling arms to Saudi Arabia, for example, it looks like a mainly or an exclusively foreign political matter. However, in reality, it is an economical, domestic, financial, and human rights issue. During Stephen Harper government, the refusal of the government to cancel the Saudi Arabia light armed vehicles deal was justified at that time by the loss of Canadian jobs. So at General Dynamics. So we can see here how what is supposed to be only foreign policy have also some sort of impact on our own decision when it comes to either healthcare or jobs or other issues. During Justin Trudeau government in 2010, the reason of not canceling the same deal was evoked as the potential financial penalty that would be paid by the Canadian government if such a deal comes to be cancelled. So once again here, we can see that there are really, like, obviously many angles to political decision, but most of the time the foreign affairs angle is going to be dismissed and is only going to be not explained or not included into the overall discussion during debates or during conversation with Canadian. And of course, hiding behind the irrelevancy of foreign policies is not really a reason. Actually, I found it as a very pathetic excuse to not allow voters to understand the complexity of political decisions. I would like to bring two examples of how foreign policy during this election should have been key, but still were not included. Of course, the fall of Kabul after the American forces left Afghanistan. Canada participated in this war for 2 decades, from 2001 until today. I mean, of course, in terms of the soldier and in terms of the military, it was until 2014, but we had a Canadian presence up to now. 158 Canadian soldiers were killed. $20 billion have been spent on that war. Internationally, this war shaped Canada foreign policy. Domestically, the same war affected the lives of Canadians, of the veterans, of their families. It affected funding decisions in the budget. It affected the reputation of Canada when it was handling the Afghan refugee prisoners when they were arrested. And so it has really many angles. However, the question of accountability around that decision to go to war was not raised at all during this last this election, and that would leave the politician and journalists literally out of the hook. I mean, the only question that was raised was about the evacuation of the Canadian who were there. Not to say that this was not important, but I think it kind of made the main issue of going there, of fighting, of not fighting any peaceful way to get out of Afghanistan, really the main topic of the question, but leaving it on the surface. The evacuation of the American forces from Afghanistan and the forceful return of the Taliban also leaves a vacuum in the region that will be eventually filled by China and India, those two powers that are really changing the geostrategical forces in the region, who have already indicated that they are accepting to collaborate and work with the Taliban government. And this will leave also Canada and the US somehow isolated, or at least not in the loop, whereas, you know, they have been there for a decade. So this is another question that should have been discussed, but it is not at all being talked about. And of course, the other example, both of my also colleague mentioned it, it's the case of the two Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and how Canada accepted under the Trump administration, under the Trump administration pressure. So it was somehow a bilateral, somehow mutual decision to arrest the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. However, later on, Canada found itself being a center of retaliation with the arrest of two of its own citizens in Chinese prison. And we can see here how foreign policy is tied to internal affairs. So it's not mainly just a domestic affair, but very global, and how they are not discussed during the campaign, or if they do, it is only a very polarized matter between the conservative a very sort of a strong punishment course and sort of coercive sort of reaction, and the liberal still talking about so I think I will stop here. I don't want to also not mention the case of course, Hussein Salil, the Canadian from Uyghur descent, who have been arrested also in China since 2007, accused and charged for terrorism. And then his life sentence was reduced to 20 years. Once again, we hear nothing about this case. So the two other Michael took somehow the first place into, unfortunately, this sad situation. But once again, we don't really talk about the other cases, like I mentioned, like Hussein Salil and other Canadian citizens who are detained abroad. And so it is not only a matter, I think what we should remind our fellow Canadian, that talking about foreign policy, it is not only a matter of talking about trade or talking with our relationship with the US. If I remember correctly, in the last debate, when Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, was asked about somehow international impact of Canada, he mentioned the foreign aid. So I think, yes, it is important, but it's still very, very little compared to all the other topics, like we mentioned, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Palestine, the Kashmir situation, Haiti, for instance, like Alex mentioned. All these countries, despite the huge trade bilateral relationship with the US and with China and India, I think at the heart remains the foreign policy matters, and specifically human rights, justice, defense of rights of individuals. So I think it is a missed opportunity, and I'm glad that we are here to talk about it today.
Thank you so much,